Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for a conversation about the current situation in Iran. We are joined today by ACG McCloy Global Trends Fellow, Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad. He is a German-Iranian political scientist who focuses on Iran, the Middle East, and the post-unipolar world. He is also the founding director of the Center for Middle East and Global Order, where he is going to head a research unit focused on transatlantic policy toward the Middle East. Ali, it is great to see you. Herzlich willkommen, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Steve. Ich bin sehr froh, hier zu sein. I'm very delighted to be here.
Well, we are very happy to have you here to help us sort of understand exactly what's going on in Iran and sort of to give us an update. I think it's fair to say that, you know, over the last couple of years, there have been a few waves of protest in Iran against the country's corrupt theocracy. The death of Mahsa Amini on September 16th of last year, while she was in police custody for wearing an improper hijab, triggered what's become perhaps the most severe and sustained political upheaval ever faced by the Islamist regime in Tehran. And so I thought maybe we could start by having you sort of set the stage for us and tell us what has happened over the past 6 months and where things stand today.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you rightly started by pointing out that Iran has had witnessed important waves of protest over the last half a decade. And starting with the turn of the year 2017-18, we had novel kind of protests in Iran, which were driven by the lower classes that were hitherto considered to be the social base of the Islamic Republic. But then again, they were taking to the streets en masse, chanting slogans against the entirety of the regime, that is both its military, but also clerical components. And this time around, very forcefully so, against both main factions of the political establishment, not only the hardliners, but also the reformists that were in some Western policy circles still, traded as some kind of hopeful agents for change, atop. But this, and then we had a continuation of those protests in November 2019. And I suggested with those two protests that a long-term revolutionary process in Iran had started. On the former one, I've written a 70-page study for the Brookings Institution, where I lay out in detail the various facets of the structural crisis that the Islamic Republic is facing, all of them structural, all of them very much attached to the kind of political crisis of, sustained authoritarianism, the, non-reformability of the system. So this was indeed a new chapter in the history of the Islamic Republic, with the lower classes not anymore the kind of loyal social base. Mm-hmm. This time around, since September, we have the missing link, which is there, and the missing link is the kind of is that the current protest movement involves various classes. During the 2009 Green Movement, it was the urban middle class. During the last protest waves that I sketched out, it was the lower class plus the lower middle class. So this time around, you see, a whole variety of, social groups being involved. So this is the kind of main difference now.
So let me ask you to tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, I find it fascinating to think about previous sort of protests being driven largely by the lower classes, and undoubtedly the economic pressures that the lower classes were under. It seems that this sort of more recent set of protests and demonstrations has been described by some as a, quote, feminist revolution because many of the protests were led by women. But it's also been described as sort of a revolt by the Generation Z, sort of that you're seeing demographics and gender play into this in a big way as well, because the next generation sort of doesn't see opportunity as it lies ahead. You know, from what you were saying at the end of your comment just now, it sounds like this new chapter is much more inclusive when thinking about the protest movement. But can you talk about some of these different strains or strands of the movement and give us a little bit of insight there?
Sure. I mean, those observations are indeed very accurate because there are four groups to be identified who are at the forefront of the revolutionary protests this time around. You mentioned the women, and obviously it was kicked off by the state murder of Kurdish Iranian girl Mahsa Jina Amini because of so-called bad hijab. And so this triggered, a lot of anger across Iranian society, where women have been harassed by the so-called morality police, not only for years, but for decades, since the very inception of the Islamic Republic. So this is something that a lot of Iranians, especially women, can relate to, the kind of repression that we've seen on Iranian streets from the so-called morality police against, women. And women also in other respects are discriminated against in a disproportionate manner. Not only do they suffer from gender apartheid, that is legal inequality that was established right after the revolution, but also in terms of socioeconomic progress, they're very much blocked in their development. That is to say that whereas today, a slight majority of Iranian students are female, in terms of working, in terms of labor participation, the rate is 1/5 that of men. In terms of the unemployment rate, it's double the rate of men. The same applies to the younger, generation of women. So you see a tremendous blockage of development, from a women's perspective. Secondly, you see Gen Z. It's a new generation that has been coming to the political scene that is characterized by a lack of fear, that is very courageous, that has different ideas and aspirations when it comes to their lives. A generation that is very much networked and globalized in in an internet world, and knows how the rest of the world, can live or lives, and has the same kind of ambition to reclaim their life. So reclaiming life is a central aspect to this revolutionary protests. So it's not only about, bread and butter issues. It is, of course. So the third group are students who have been always a center of dissent. So this is not something new. It has been, there's been tremendous student activism in all major universities all across the country. Like in the past, we have, when it came to the street protests, unprecedented, a wide geographical, expansion, covering all corners of the country, and involving not only hundreds of thousands of people, but probably into 2 million people, according to some estimates. And the last group are so-called marginalized ethnicities. Iran, has a lot of ethnicities. Most of them do, consider themselves to be Iranian. The regime has tried to basically label the protest movement and delegitimize it as one driven by Kurdish separatism, but there have been enormous, cross-ethnic solidarity with the uprising that had started in Kurdistan of, Amini's home region. Those marginalized ethnicities, not only the Kurds, but also the Baluch in the southeast, have, despite the relative decline of street protests over the last few months, sustained quite a high degree of activism and street protests also strikes. So those are, two centers of dissent in Iran, and the kind of anger is fueled by a dual discrimination, political and socioeconomic, because there is also not enough, investment in the infrastructures in those regions. There is much higher unemployment. There is some even, of course, resentment from the Persian, kind of majority. And there is confessional discrimination, because those two groups are, in many parts Sunni in a state that defines itself as Shia. So those four groups are at the forefront of the revolutionary protests this time around. Doesn't mean that a lot of other social groups have taken part in it.
I mean, it really is, pretty spectacular when you think about it. How many people took to the streets, right? I mean, you quoted a number that I had seen as well, that some 2 million people in more than 160 cities and towns across the country took to the streets. I think, according to some estimates, hundreds of people have died in these protests and thousands of people are in prisons. It seems as if the protests have now slowed down a little bit, partly due to the suppression by the regime, but perhaps also due to some of the exhaustion by the protesters. Can you sort of talk about what the mood is like right now, with so many people who have been jailed, and so much sort of dissent, even if it's under the surface right now and not taking the form of these massive protests that we saw last fall?
Absolutely. I mean, at the very start of the protests in mid-September, I very much highlighted the fact that within revolutionary processes, periods of relative calm and uproar are quite normal. So we should understand it in this kind of broader perspective. Otherwise, one would fall into the trap of, misunderstanding the situation, as we did with the Arab Spring. Remember when in 2010, 2011, one was we're talking about a seasonal incident, assumedly an Arab Spring then being, turned into a winter, and
Right.
everything was over. But this, of course, is not accurate. Because, also in the Arab context, we have a long-term revolutionary process, and we've seen the second wave of the Arab uprisings in 2018 and 2019. So in the Iranian context, so something similar, in my view, is happening. That is to say that in terms of the number of street protests, we had a height from mid-September till mid-November last year, and then we had a relative decline of street protests until the turn of the year. And ever since, we've seen very little street protest because of the factors that you mentioned. And we've seen a reemergence of some street protests during Nowruz, the Iranian New Year celebrations, around 20th of March. And then we had still, occasionally strike actions in different sectors of the economy. But in other words, to put it differently, there are some scholars who say that we've seen a revolutionary episode, and this revolutionary episode may also have ended. But then again, in the current phase, we are in a phase in which organization, strategy, and coordination is on the mind of civil society in Iran itself, but also among the Iranian diaspora that has been very, very active in this process. For instance, we've seen the release of a document from trade union and civil society organizations, 20 of them, formulating their minimum demands of radical political and social change in Iran. We've seen, in the diaspora coalition, of course, also forming with their own set of charter. So we've seen some thinking beyond the day and how to, in terms of strategizing, in terms of coordinating. But given the tremendous economic problems that the country faces, an economic crisis that has a strong socioeconomic feature of 50 percent inflation, only officially, unofficially, probably double the number.
Mhm.
That is disproportionately affecting, more socially vulnerable households, is, in my view, going to reignite renewed street protests,
Mhm.
as we've seen in the past. Protests driven by the so-called social question, going to turn political swiftly. And so my expectation is that we're going to see the reemergence of street protests, a new wave of relative uproar in the country. Iran is, because of the structural problems that the regime has and is not able to solve, is mired in a longer process of tumult and chaos by re-energized street protests and repression.
One of the things that I was reading about was, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier in our conversation, that you certainly said that this is a new chapter that we're seeing unfolding. Others have written that Iran has embarked on a completely uncharted and irreversible course with these protests, and with sort of how out in the open the criticism and concern is about the current government, and that there really is a pushback. And so one of the questions, obviously, that's being asked by so many people is, is Iran on the brink of really a full-scale revolution? Are the kinds of protests that we saw last fall really sustainable? You've indicated that you think that rising tensions and rising pressures will lead to more protests in the coming months. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we're not talking about years from now. We're talking about months from now. And so I guess, the question is, what's the dimension of this revolution, for lack of a better word, or what's the dimension of this descent that we're seeing?
So I think, first of all, when it comes to the dimension is quite widespread. That is to say that I consider the gulf that has developed between state and society to be irreversible. Because of a number of factors. There's, socioeconomic problems, there is a political crisis, there is a sociocultural, demographic, and so forth. So, and then there's little indication that the regime has any kind of policy answers to those grievances. Although top regime people do understand those very problems, but surprisingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, when it comes to long-established dictatorships and autocracies, there's little indication that they're going to be policy responsive to that. When it comes to the revolutionary process, for the revolutionary process to enter the next stage, qualitatively speaking, would the next stage being defined as one of revolutionary situation or moment, this would, in my view, require three factors. One is the quantitative expansion of the revolutionary process. That is, more people ought to take to the streets, probably in the hundreds of thousands, which would also, make it difficult for a brutal regime like the Iranian one to totally clamp down on such massive numbers. And of course, it would galvanize other people to join the street protests as well. Secondly, a qualitative expansion. This would involve, primarily a permanent strike action from the labor movement, from the workers in Iran, in strategic sectors of the economy, that is the oil, gas, and petrochemical industries. But this is, this is filled with, tremendous challenges. The working class lacks the economic resources to sustain longer periods of strike action because of the kind of also neoliberal policies that have been introduced in the political economy of the Islamic Republic when it comes to workers' contracts since the 1990s. So the precarious situation of the workers is a problem. The highly securitized environment of those industries that I mentioned, all of them are controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is another problem because it's not only immediately securitized but also militarized once dissent breaks out, and so forth. And then, of course, the question of a credible alternative that is necessary to encourage people to believe in a successful outcome of a revolutionary process. And lastly, we need rifts within the power and security apparatus. And we do see some disillusionment, also important disillusionment, but in terms of defections, we don't see important defections yet. And the latter aspect is also, a consequence of our Western policy, because our policy can either, help generate those rifts with the power elite, or send the opposite signal that nothing major is going to happen to the Islamic Republic, and sooner or later business as usual could continue.
So, Ali, I want to come to the Western policy in just a second, and have a couple of questions related to that. But before we go there, one thing that I was curious about, and at least one of our viewers submitted a question about, is sort of what is the role of Iranian religious leaders in all of this? And have any of them joined the protests and been supportive of the protests? And how could they influence the protest movement, but also how could they influence the governing regime?
Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, in terms of the power structure in the Islamic Republic, we have to understand that the clerical elite is no more the dominant one. So basically, it's the RGC, it's the military that rules the country. But of course, there is a symbiotic relationship between the two because they do need each other. And Khamenei, who's not only the supreme leader, but also is the highest religious kind of figure. But there is a strong disillusionment in terms of religiosity in Iranian society after 4 decades of real existing Islamism. So this is why we've seen a stronger component of nationalism in the nationalism-Islamism ideological mix of the regime. Mm-hmm. That said, there have been some critical, statements from parts of the Iranian Shia clergy, but not to the extent that that this would be destabilizing. But the leader of the Sunni community, who is Abdul Hamid Maulana, who is the kind of the Friday prayer leader in the capital city of the southeastern province of Sistan Baluchistan, has been a vocal critic of the supreme leader, which is quite novel because, he on paper he is his representative, but we've seen after Friday prayers since mid-September incessant street protests. Mm-hmm. So no interruption at all. And quite heavy criticism from the Sunni leader of Iran vis-a-vis Khamenei, and also the call for a referendum. So this is a huge challenge for the regime, as we know from leaked documents.
Mm-hmm. So I guess again, one more question before we sort of expand the aperture a little bit, and this comes from a viewer who says that they're a friend of yours from Frankfurt. Curious to know whether the regime is still a regional power in the way in which it is portraying itself to be. So let's put Iran in the context of the region itself, and both the government claims, but then also how is the country really stacking up vis-a-vis its neighbors? Yeah.
So, I mean, as you know, Iran's regional policies are, based upon the axis of evil, axis of resistance. This was a tongue stick, but well. So the axis of resistance, which is comprised of different militias, pro-Tehran militias, not only Shia militias in countries, most notably Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen to a certain extent, and in a few other places in the region. They had their climax of power in the mid 2000s. So, in the wake of the US-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. So over the years, and especially over the last decade, that is since the signing of the last nuclear deal, we've seen a relative decline of Iranian power. But Iran is still a dominant player because probably the weakness of its rivals. But Trump's maximum pressure sanctions have created a lot of financial headache for the Islamic Republic because it could not go on, financially nurturing those militias as it used to. So their activities have been relatively reduced. And then, more importantly, Iranian soft power has declined importantly throughout the region because Iran wants to sell itself as a kind of, representative of the Shias. But we've seen that in such important Shia regions, such as southern Iraq. We've seen that Shia Iraqis, mostly young ones, during the second wave of the Arab uprising in 2018-19, had taken to the streets, chanting anti-Iran slogans, burning down Iranian consulates, and so on. So, and then the same anti-Iran resentment was also heard in the same wave of the Arab uprisings in Lebanon. So you see that in terms of soft power, Iran has no more the standing that it used to have after 9/11. So this is quite important in terms of the public, appeal of. But then, talking about the region, perhaps I should say a few words about the Iran-Saudi deal, which has been, sold as a kind of revolutionary game changer. And I would be, the plan is to restore diplomatic ties after 6 or 7 years of, no diplomatic ties within 2 months. So that's a kind of, ambition to normalize them. And the Iranian, and which I explained in a piece that was just published today. So this was, the Islamic Republic felt pressured internationally because of increasing signs of isolation because of the crackdown of the protests. So it forged a deal with the rival, the arch rival, to portray a good, to send a message to the international community that it could still be considered as a kind of cooperative element in international politics. So in other words, this deal, although we don't know the contents of it, is supposed to reduce the heightened pressure that has developed on the Islamic Republic, both from within and outside. This is, in my view, this could lead to a relative détente. But we don't know about the future, if we're going to see more tensions, let's say, between Iran and Israel because of the Iranian nuclear program, and how would Saudi Arabia act in such a constellation. So this kind of thing stands on a quite fragile ground.
So there is a follow-up from one of our viewers who sort of anticipated that you would talk a little bit about this new sort of form of rapprochement between Iran and the Saudis. And the viewer points out that this was, of course, brokered by China. And so one of the big questions is, and you've alluded to this, sort of how long will this period of relative détente hold? And, as a corollary to that, particularly given China's role in helping broker this deal, should the West, the United States, Europe, be concerned about China's new mediation role?
Well, there have been 2 to 3 years of talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, hosted by Iraq and Oman, which did not see any results. Now, all of a sudden, we have this kind of breaking news. China is presenting itself as a facilitator. Of course, China has very good relations with both countries. With Saudi Arabia, it has very close energy partnership, much more important than with Iran. With Iran, it has forged a 25-year accord, the contents of which are totally unknown. I think we talked about it the last time. And of course, China wants to see a stable Middle East because this is where its main supplies of oil hail from. And China probably fears a potential escalation on the horizon between Israel and Iran over the latter's nuclear program that may see the kind of destabilization that we've seen over the last few years, with Iran responding to Trump's maximum pressure by attacking oil and other critical infrastructure of its southern neighbors. Climaxing in September 2019 in the drone attack on Abqaiq and Khurais, the main oil facility in Saudi Arabia, and knocking off half of its production for some time. So the Saudis want to avoid the repetition of this very same scenario in the event of escalating tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But then again, we don't know how this will play out. After all, Saudi Arabia and Iran have also come together over the last years over the Iran challenge. So they do have similar concerns. There's been an accumulation of the lack of confidence between Iran and Saudi Arabia that is also difficult to bridge, really, and to assume that normalization is going to go swift and uncomplicated. So, in other words, China, I wouldn't consider all of this a geopolitical revolution. It's very much, it was very much in the cards, perhaps, but it also shows the kind of relative, perhaps, decline of U.S. power in the region.
And so before we come to sort of the Western response or even the Western role, another viewer was interested in sort of picking up on the China question that we just talked a little bit about, but then was also interested in your take on sort of the deepening ties between Iran and Russia, and whether that's something that you can comment on as well.
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to Iran and China, first of all, despite the New York Times, doing a piece years ago after the signing of that agreement of an allegedly impending $400 billion in Chinese investment in Iran, nothing of that sort has materialized. I mean, there are tremendous challenges and reluctance from the Chinese side to properly invest in Iran. For instance, over the last year, we've seen even countries like Afghanistan outstripping, foreign direct investment into Iran than China. So you see the kind of, and then of course there are, since the deals in non-transparency, both with the 25-year one with China already forged, and another 20-year one that is planned to be signed, as Moscow and Tehran now say, in the week of a recent also bilateral state visit. So the contents are totally unknown, and we can assume that because of Iran is the weaker geopolitical partner in both constellations, and because of the heavy pressure that the regime has been facing over years now, both internally and externally, that its aim is to seek an outside guarantor for stability and survival, being assumed by Russia and China on the international diplomatic stage, and then for the Iranians ready to engage in a kind of sellout of national interest and resources, the latter mostly on probably pertaining to preferential access of China and Russia to Iranian oil and gas resources in the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea. When it comes to Iran and China, Iran and Russia, of course, there is this, Iranian military support for Russia's war in Ukraine that has been a top concern for European policymakers. one could argue, one could say that even more so than the heavy crackdown of the protests, because the Russia factor, in my view, has been more, contributing to kind of rethinking of Iran policy in some quarters. And we see also reports of not only drone supplies, but also of other military equipment and logistics and training and so forth. And most recently, we have a report, I believe, from the Wall Street Journal saying that Russia has provided Iran with advanced surveillance capabilities that the Iranian regime, of course, uses to kind of upgrade its authoritarianism at home. So there is, of course, this kind of element of authoritarians, cooperating with each other for the sake of their own regime stability. Yes, there is some cooperation going on, but at the end of the day, it will, the sheer asymmetry of power between the two sides, for instance, Iran and Russia, gonna remain. Despite the fact that Russia, of course, is now under much more heavy pressure than it used to be.
So let's come back to sort of the response by the West, the role of the West, and you started to touch on this a little bit, even just now in your comment that Europe seems to be more concerned about Iran's military support for Russia in the war in Ukraine than its reaction to the protests. And so I'd almost like to start with, what's going on the ground in Iran on a national level, and then we can expand our conversation to look at what's going on in the region more broadly. But of course, one of the things that came up a fair amount last month when the German government's sort of feminist foreign policy was released was that given the fact that so many women had been at the forefront of the protests in Iran, this was sort of a natural for looking at the foreign offices and Germany's feminist foreign policy in a very practical context, and in an on-the-ground context. So can you talk a little bit about Berlin's response to the protests, and what role Germany or even Europe more broadly can play in what's happening in the dissent that you described at the beginning of our conversation?
Sure. So, so far, it is fair to say that European response has to what has been going on in Iran, which can be considered as historical, to be quite mild and or conservative. We've seen half a dozen of very mild EU sanctions packages being imposed upon Iran over the last half a year. None of them has been targeting the power elite, the top people there. Even not the top people of the RGC. So elements from various quarters, and also there has been no listing of the RGC as a terrorist organization, which, in my view, despite the need to realistically account for potential risks, would have two major advantages. One is to signal to the protest movement at a time of impasse, of a stalemate between the protesters and the regime side, with neither side being able to overwhelm the other, that it could breathe fresh air into the protest movement, signaling that the West is changing course and is not more, following the kind of policies that could have been described over the past few years after the nuclear deal of 2015, as to be not only seeking détente and rapprochement, but having also an appeasing factor to it. So, secondly, and more importantly, a terrorism listing of the RGC by the European Union could send a strong signal into the power and security apparatus of the Islamic Republic that the system as a whole has no future. This is tremendously important because it could generate rifts and defections, by such a step. But Europe is still mired in a lot of anxieties over this potential listing, although if one could look at the ramifications of the United States listing of the RGC, one could easily conclude that the kind of rhetoric emanating, the counter, warnings and threats emanating from Tehran, should not be taken at face value.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a reluctance here, and this reluctance is also very much embedded in a kind of continuity of thinking about Iran, which I call Iran, the dominance of Iran Versteher, those the Russia understanders or Russia empathizers. So we had the same thing in the policy circles in Iran going on, not only with the advisors, but also with the kind of mindset in many policy circles. So a lot of assumptions, both on Russia and China, that were very similar actually to each other. I'm currently writing a piece on this. And it's quite striking to see the kind of similarities. And all of this boils down to the fact that it is not safe to assume that one could, deal in practical terms with a autocracy that has aggressive components to it. Mm-hmm. So it is not going to serve, our stability concerns. But then again, the whole issue of the revival of the deal and Iran's advanced nuclear program is creating headaches in the European policy circles. There is a confusion. There is the lack of willingness to list the RGC, because one fears that this would discourage the Iranians to renegotiate the nuclear agreement and close the door to any possible negotiations. But I think this again is mistaken, because this has not happened after the US did the same. And so there is still a kind of, there's a lack of a paradigm shift in the wake of the paradigm shift that is happening in Iran and on Iran.
So let me maybe push you a little bit, and this might be a little bit of a provocative question that tries to pull a couple of different threads together. I mean, if you're saying that we're not really seeing this paradigm shift unfold in the West in terms of the Western response. At the same time, you're in the process of launching a new endeavor, right? Your Center for the Middle East and the Global Order. As a ACG McCloy Fellow, you're going to be researching sort of the policy of the West toward authoritarian states, and particularly toward a country like Iran, with a focus on interests and values, and how one can try to use sort of common interests and common values to bring about some of the changes. I guess if you're not seeing the paradigm shift in Western capitals, what gives you any sense of optimism that Western policy or a joint transatlantic policy toward authoritarian states could have an impact when it comes to this kind of reconciliation?
Absolutely. I think one major lesson to be learned from the Russian experience is that it is not safe to assume that, first of all, engaging in trade would necessarily lead autocratic leaders from the other side to open up civil society space. Why should they do that? I mean, they want to try to cement their role and not to undermine their role. So there have been false assumptions about autocratic behavior, and there's been a lack of understanding that human rights and socioeconomic development, in a sustainable sense, are intimately linked with stability. Because this is, in my view, the major lesson to be learned from the Arab uprisings. You have, Europe's neighboring region, the Middle East, is rife with, disproportionately high socioeconomic problems and political authoritarianism, also in relation to other world regions. So those are structural grievances. and to keep continuing our policy of the last decades under the paradigm of authoritarian stability, to think that authoritarian regimes can provide stability in a sustainable fashion is utterly misleading. So this is the first realization here. So we need something else. We need something that is, a policy, a foreign policy toward the region that actually can help empower civil society and not end up cementing authoritarian rule through the kind of dealings, economic or political dealings that we are doing. Mm-hmm. Why transatlantic? Because those autocracies, and we've indicated that before in terms of the kind of cooperation that that exists between Iran and Russia and China, like-minded autocracies have no qualms whatsoever to engage in a close cooperation with each other to cement their own respective rules. So the same kind of coordination and cooperation should happen in the democratic world, which I do not see, at least in the case of Iran. There is no transatlantic coordination that deserves its name, although the advantages would be very clear, because those regimes do understand the language of power. And otherwise, the opposite would be the case. That is, Tehran seeing whatever the West does or does not as a sign of weakness. So this is the kind of policy assumption on which also Iranian policies are designed. It's Western weakness. So this kind of, from the Biden administration, we want to return to the nuclear deal, and not indicating that more leverage or more options, or more policy areas should be considered, but keeping the focus on the nuclear deal, which is a strategic mistake because it provides Iran with the advantage to dictate the course, and we see it just now. We've seen yesterday the news last night of the United States, briefing Western European countries, but also Israel about talks that may have been, ongoing with the Islamic Republic about an interim agreement on the nuclear issue, under which Iran would not be able to enrich uranium more than 60%, and in return to some sanctions relief. So it seems that we still have this kind of focus, and I think what is important here is to create a new paradigm, to understanding the risk of the authoritarian stability paradigm that is really shaky, and to seek ways to define a policy that can bring mid and long-term stability. And this is the main challenge, because if we do not do that, we're going to have regular explosions of popular rage around European borders, which we're going to try to react to somehow micromanage, whatever. It's only a reactive role. We have to be more proactive and understand the structural challenges that this entire geopolitical landscape presents to us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but Ali, it seems like it's a big task, right, to try to create this new paradigm. And so, sort of, how optimistic are you that there's a willingness to have that kind of paradigm shift?
Yeah. Well, this is a very good question, because, as you know, effecting such a change is huge. But I do think that the timing could not be more opportune, because we've seen the lessons from Europe's Russia policy in terms of European security. So there is some important rethinking also in Germany's foreign policy circles. So I think, the Russian example is very much, a lesson to be learned here, but also the lessons that we forgot to learn about the Arab uprisings and the kind of misunderstandings that we had. And all of that was facilitated, of course, by, kind of political advisory that was probably biased, So this is also something that we should be very clear about. and because I mean the future of the region lies with the civil societies. There is no doubt about that. But our European policy or Western policy suggests the exact opposite, as if the future of the region lies with the regimes.
Mm-hmm. So let me maybe switch gears a little bit, because a couple of viewers have asked questions that relate to oil and Iran, and I actually think that they do tie into the broader conversation. One of our viewers writes that Iran claims that its oil output and exports have been increasing recently, but the statistics just are not transparent. It's very difficult to determine if that's the case. Do you know if Iran is able to export more oil in violation of US sanctions? And is this reflected in the state of the Iranian economy at all?
Well, first of all, it's true that the Iranian administration every week or two claims that they have a new record of oil exports. But then again, there are still US sanctions, extraterritorial ones. So on paper, we still have the Trump sanctions, right? Mm-hmm. But since day one, the Biden administration has been refraining from fully implementing the sanctions regime on Iran, perhaps as a sign of goodwill toward the revival of the nuclear deal. So that, I think this February, we've seen a 4-time high of Iranian oil supplies to China, most of them in an illicit manner. So via, ships with no, where the radars are knocked off, all kinds of different international networks where the Iranians have been, involved in this kind of illicit, exports. So that, on the other hand, we don't know how much the Iranian leadership, gets from that in terms of revenues. Also considering the fact that Iran has been, offering the Chinese quite important oil discounts. And probably this discount has also been elevated after the Russians are also giving discounts to the Chinese. Mm-hmm. So we don't know about the exact amount of revenue, but we can certainly say that it helps the economic lifeline of the Islamic Republic. Mm-hmm. And a major request. So what the West could do is to look, more closely, especially the United States, of course, into the sanctions regime. And this has been a major point of criticism that was also leveled against the Biden administration's Iran policy.
So the second question related to oil sort of puts oil into a bit more of a historical context. And you've been talking during our conversation about the kinds of lessons that one can learn by looking at other situations, but also by looking at history. And so I think this is a good way to sort of bring our conversation to a close. One of our viewers comments that oil is intrinsically tied to Iran's history, and this goes back to the nationalization of oil in Iran. And the viewer goes on to say that there are a large number of scholars that basically say that the strong sort of anti-Western sentiment that we're seeing in Iran today has its roots in colonialist activities and the international struggle with the British and the Americans when it comes to oil. Do you think that the sort of anti-Western sentiments that we've seen in Iran are related to this struggle? Do you correlate sort of the history of oil and scarce resources to that, or are there other things at play when it comes to this viewpoint of the West?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first of all, yes, historically speaking, there is a strong connection here between anti-American sentiments and the kind of role that the United States and the UK played in the early 1950s in fighting the Iranian oil nationalization, drive, and by initiating a coup d'etat against Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister of the time, and of course in collaboration with domestic elements, including from the clergy in Iran. So yes, and the Islamic Republic has been very strong in instrumentalizing this kind of historical trauma for its own purposes of ruling. Although, Khomeini, the founder of the same Islamic Republic, was was quite was not a friend at all. Was quite an enemy of the idea that Mossadegh stood for, a kind of democratic nationalism and a kind of third world nationalism that is also secular. But be it as it may, the place of anti-American sentiments has changed over the 4 decades of the Islamic Republic because of the experiences that Iranians have made with the system. Whereas after 9/11, one could argue that there was an element of a rallying around the flag, element when it came, for instance, about discussions about the possibility of a neocon kind of U.S. neocon military assault on Iran. Over the last decade, a lot has changed in Iran. You see that the population primarily blames its own government or its own regime for instance, the kind of harsh economic sanctions that were imposed by the United States and others. And so there is an intimate understanding after 4 decades of experience with this kind of governance system that anti-Americanism is an indispensable pillar of the Islamic Republic that it is going to be deployed for its own regime stability reasons, and not for national interests as the regime rhetoric would suggest. So yes, in terms of and there is a famous slogan during the protests over the last 5 years that reflects what I said. Which is nicely rhyming in Persian, but which is saying that our enemy is, or they always say it's America. So the regime always say it's America, but our real enemy is at home. Mm-hmm. So this speaks a volume. Also chanted by, for instance, school girls, but also from people inside of mosques. So yes, anti-Americanism is understood to be an ideology favored by the regime that turns out to be detrimental to what can be called national interests.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ali, I want to thank you very much for helping us understand what really is an extraordinary political moment in Iran, but also for putting it into the broader context, because I think we can't just look at what's happening in Iran in a vacuum, but need to see it in a much broader sense. And so I just want to thank you again for taking the time to give us your impressions and your perspectives, and to wish you well with the new center. And I look forward to speaking again when that's off the ground, and when there are more topics and issues to talk about.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the wonderful conversation that you moderated, and thank you everyone for the great questions. I enjoyed it a lot.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too. Dankeschön. Bye-bye.